Hi class, welcome to Module 7 as we look at mental health as part of the sociology of medicine as we start looking at these issues. There's been a real medicalization of mental health to the extent that mental illnesses are an important piece of healthcare and trying to understand it. And sociology programs at larger universities have whole classes just on the sociology of mental illness. We don't have that availability here with Dr. Madigan and I as our lone sociologists, nor do I consider myself developed enough in that area to explore it. In fact, even as a medical social worker, my focus was always on rehabilitation of people with physical disabilities as we look at disability and illness and chronic illness, and not on mental health. But it is so important for us to consider this here in the United States as well as across the world. What are the issues that affect society related to mental health? In my social problems class, I always talk about how we form a social problem, and though you don't need to know that for this particular class, what makes up a social problem, mental illness, the treatment of mental illness in our country becomes part of that social problem. And that's what we're examining as we look at this particular chapter. So over the years, researchers used a variety of methods to look at the extent of mental illness, how it existed and how to measure it. And first, societies looked from simple to complex, understanding the behavior, what was acceptable and what was not acceptable in society, and how we labeled mental illness. Now remember, as with disability, there is no clear definition of normalcy. And so it's very difficult to measure, and the measurement changes over time. So in all societies, the behavior of some individuals are considered to be unacceptable or incomprehensible. You know, we think about how people interact, the violation of children, not acceptable in society, what comes into place. And there's some significant difference as we start to measure this. We look for these symptoms of mental disorder that are fairly common. So we got 31% of working age adult report a diagnosable mental illness. Now remember, diagnosable falls within that category that we put it into the definition of a mental illness in some form or the other. So it either sits in the ICD-9 codes, which are codes of illness, or we have it in the DSM. Now the DSM is always being updated. So at one point, you consider homosexuality was part of the DSM. As we look at cigarette smoking, it is part of the DSM, the addiction to cigarettes. And so it varies. So major depression and alcohol problems are the most common of these diagnoses that we look into place. And so we can see alcohol, depression, addiction coming into place as high levels. So what relates within that? Well, recent research has uncovered a few real significant pieces of ethnic differences or gender differences, has uncovered few significant differences between ethnic differences or gender differences in the rate of mental illness. However, men display higher rates of paranoid schizophrenia, higher levels of substance abuse and personality disorders, where women display higher rates of depression and anxiety disorders. And this has been standard throughout, pretty powerful as we look at these differences. Now, is that biological? Is that social? Is it the acceptability that you can express certain things? Is it adjusting to those diagnoses by self-treating in the case of increasing your alcohol content or drug addiction to treat other issues? Hard to tease out, isn't it, as we start looking at this process. So, chronic illness affects mental health more than acute stress does. And so we see that as we look at chronic stress coming into place, that day in and day out of poverty, day in and day out of life that is unsuccessful, chronic stress being a work environment. It may be multiple things that come into place, that it affects more of that mental health than the acute stress does. So the quick stress, the horrible stress that comes into place when you've lost your job, but you come into that place of, I've got to find another job, and down the road I get a new job. Depression comes into place, all of those reactions, but the long-term effects are much more acute if I'm out of work for years or I can't earn enough to support my family. We can see how those stressful events, and researchers look at the number of stressful events in your life, and they attribute the meaning to those life events. So we even have scales that look at what were your stresses in the last, how many people did you lose in your life that you were close to, what was the problems within your job, the stress that comes into place. And all of those are measured as we start to look at the issues. To doctors, mental illness is an illness like any other. And following that medical model, remember the medical model versus the social model in that process. The medical model looks at measuring and defining mental illness. It looks at mental illness stems largely or solely from something within the individual, psychologically or biologically. And mental illness will worsen if left untreated, that you need to be seeking results and coming into place, and that treating mental illness rarely, if ever, harms the patient. Some interesting processes we see that. So that role, if we come from that medical model, has some influence in how to treat the disorder. Now, models of mental illness compares to the sociological model that we've talked about before. And it suggests that psychiatric diagnoses are neither valid or reliable, and that psychiatric diagnosis system, or the what we look at in that DSM-5, the DSM-5, is put together by man. It's a social construct that comes into place and has furthered the medicalization process instead of looking at the social implications. In other words, the issues of social stress that you're talking about here that are linked to class-based issues, or the mental problems that lead to lower social class, that when you have mental problems that tie you to that process. So pretty significant as we look at it. So what's going on here? How does social stress help explain class, gender, race, and mental illness? As you start examining this, I especially want you to think about that as you watch your videos for this particular chapter. I think you will find it very interesting as the diagnosis has come into place, and the diagnosis also affects the individual within society. So we have a number of things that come into interacting with this population. There are significant issues for society in looking at mental health in the community. So to look at this, Goffman, a sociologist in the 1950s and 60s, is doing research in veterans hospitals. He is the person who writes the book Stigma that we've talked about, and he really looks at mental hospitals as a total institution, large institutions that regiment the lives and segregate people from the outside world, that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The patients become what others expect them to be. You can see the looking glass self theory almost come out in this process, that we've decided you are this, and it adds to that. And as he studies this and he sees the stigma of society coming out, he can really look at how self-image is damaged and replaced by this personality adapted to institutional life, and the role of the patient becomes a master status, and taken away the other master statuses of father and child, and those master statuses of our lives that we've looked at throughout sociology. There was a significant move to deinstitutionalize the mental health population that came along in the late 50s and 60s. It was tied to a number of things. One of them is the introduction of psychotropic drugs. Now, remember, psychotropic drugs, if you know them at all, were originally found successful for surgery. They were used to medicate the patient prior to surgery, and they found this effect that comes from that. And there was that move to move them out of homes, plus the high cost of institutions. So we see by the 1970s that a significant population of institutions are closed, and these institutions were horrible. I could show you videos related to the care of people with mental illness, as well as those that are considered at a lower functioning level of mental retardation. And we move this population back into the community with limited social supports. We come to this particular issue that creates the environment that comes today. So, becoming a mental patient, it has that label of putting you in place. It's self-labeling. You're labeled by families and friends and the public. You face the labeling of the psychiatric establishment, and you worry about, you come into that piece. They explore the benefits of treatment. And yet the treatment may also have significant side effects that affect your ability to do what you previously had done before. The use of antidepressants and mood stabilizers and antipsychotropics just so increased, and we saw this increase come in place, but there's multiple side effects, and there's this whole hazard of the stigma of mental illness. And when we see people with mental illness, we're concerned about even having them in our neighborhoods. This is a part of the big issues that we face within the process. With that said, you will cover a great deal in this chapter. You can already see, and we won't even come close to covering all the issues that are faced within society related to mental health, the effect on the families, the mental, that stigma of fighting to be fitting in society, or the acceptance that you may need a mental health day, but you don't qualify because how are you truly sick in the process? So you only have one thing to see beyond your reading, and if you look at the PowerPoint beyond this lecture, it's a film called The Released. It is a documentary by PBS, done in 2009. I know that sounds old because now we're 8-9 years out, but it still hits on significant issues that are faced by those with mental illness, and how they end up in the prison system, and how the prison system becomes that holding place for mental illness that replaces some of those institutions that we eliminated in the 60s and 70s. By the way, nursing homes do the same things. And we see this process playing out with problems in our system. With that said, you close with your discussion board. What can be done to improve mental illness treatment in the U.S. and why would the changes work and why won't they work? Something for you to think about, and support your answers with class information. I think you will find interesting the statistics of this chapter and the concerns that come into place and the patient experience. With that, I hope you have a great week. We're moving into spring break next week, so I hope you have a great one.